Imaginer sanjusante,
Vanillaware is a developer who seems very comfortable working in and exploring facets of the fantasy genre, which for the most part suits their distinct artistic direction. They are also adept at creating engaging narratives within their games, often with multiple storylines to follow. Their presentation style is noteworthy on its own, but what sets 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim apart from their repertoire is the jump into atmospheric science fiction with an expanded narrative scope. Reviews for 13 Sentinels describe it as a visual novel, which isn't totally untrue. It is a primarily narrative-driven experience where much of the time, the player's main goal is to progress the story. It also blends elements of strategy and adventure games too. The game teases action and spectacle. However, it quickly becomes apparent that it's actually a non-linear narrative experience, with a focused examination of its characters and their unique circumstances. This may seem like a bait and switch, but things evolve in such natural, yet unexpected ways to reveal one of the more ambitious efforts in video game storytelling available. Fantasy stories tend to be globe-trotting adventures, never staying in one place for too long. Important events take place in locations that aren't necessarily accommodating to living humans, like volcanoes or mountaintops, or simply too surreal or abstract altogether, like the underworld. Very few might ask Vanillaware to depict a more modern, seemingly restrictive scenario with this visual style. You can see for yourself what this interpretation looks like in the video. But what's especially striking is the use of lighting in the environments. Almost all of the lighting is practical, which in filmmaking jargon refers to any light that exists diegetically. In other words, it means the light is coming from something within the environment. Windows, for example, would be an example of practical lighting. The setting sun leaking through the classroom windows coat the scenes with a warmth that's almost disarming. By contrast, the dingy alleyways lit solely by the dim lamps might suggest a more unsavory situation. These locations get repeated throughout, but it never once feels cheap, because that kind of detail goes a long way in creating an atmosphere. The game makes the familiar seem extraordinary, and this is demonstrated by how the characters and settings are fleshed out. For a game that relies so heavily on dialogue, there's just as much effort put into the visuals and expressiveness of the characters, if not more. This comes through even in the localization. English performances were apparently a last-minute decision that delayed the release of the game in the West. As someone who doesn't understand Japanese, I'm not so sure if I would have found it nearly as engaging as I would have if the soundtrack wasn't in English. It simply would be much more difficult to follow if the English track wasn't an option, considering the circumstances under which the localization was produced, and the volume of lines that had to be read. It's nothing short of a miracle that it's as well implemented as it is.
You're kind of a simple guy. There's something about you, though.
What are you even saying?
I'm saying, I'm gonna miss you.
The early moments are spent completing the prologues for the available protagonists, serving to teach the ins and outs of its point-and-click adventure mechanics, and of course acclimating players to the world 13 Sentinels tries to build. The storylines feel familiar or somewhat predictable at first. Juro, and Iori especially, follow a typical, slice-of-life anime approach to their structure that you might have seen before. This feeling of déjà vu compounds as you explore the other storylines and engage with the combat systems. This is no accident. Director George Kamatani has detailed exactly which source materials the game draws its inspiration from. These range anywhere from obscure Japanese manga and anime, to classical Western literature, to less obscure media.
Input. Artwork. Abyssinia. Adam Dunn.
Holy crow, you can read!
The callbacks and references used in the game are intended to be a jumping off point for the story. In the interest of keeping things fresh, I won't go into each narrative in depth, but each one has got their own clever subversion on the tropes they represent. There's a fun metagame to be had where, if you're keen to do so, you can guess where each story comes from. Just as an extra precaution, don't read any of the interview links in the description until after you complete the game. There's a seemingly infinite number of routes the player can take with the story depending on who they choose on the carousel. Each story could also potentially carry their own game, but the members of the ensemble are given equal weight. Furthermore, the protagonist of one story may also appear in another as a supporting character. These appearances may hit differently depending on the order you play in. Cameos may elicit feelings of surprise or even suspicion. The result is a world that feels that much more alive than if they never interacted altogether. With that in mind, no two players experience 13 Sentinels the same way. You might say that a pastiche of influence runs the risk of being messy, or that interweaving storylines are a clumsy way to present a narrative. This is certainly not the case with 13 Sentinels, although character intersections tend to make sense in thematic and tonal ways, but not necessarily in chronological ways. In plain terms, there's an apparent over-reliance on the use of flashbacks. Admittedly, this makes events hard to keep track of, but if things don't fall into place for you at first, there's a reason analysis shares space on the main menu. Putting the lore into its own menu, thereby giving it weight on par with the other two gameplay modes, Remembrance and Destruction, acknowledges the complexity of the story while giving players more control over their experience without the need for outside resources. Analysis is most useful when returning from a break, allowing the player to recap their experience on their own terms without replaying chapters or needing to access half-finished guides online. Lore entries unlock as you encounter them. New context is also updated for anything that makes repeated appearances, as to ensure they're not out of sync with the narrative. This may not seem like that big of a deal. In theory, a player could marathon through Remembrance to keep the momentum going, and thought clouds are there to remind players what's relevant in the moment. These tools allow 13 Sentinels to strike a balance between the intent of the author and the autonomy of the player. Aside from the occasional gate to progression, the structure and pace of the narrative is primarily determined by the player.
It's the most delicious food this era has to offer.
Not to be content solely with its adventure game mechanics, there exists another gameplay mode to engage with in 13 Sentinels. As with most RPGs, loadout diversity is the key to success, and this is no different in Destruction. Every protagonist pilots their own mech, called Sentinels, in each mission, ranging from 1st to 4th generation Sentinels that have varied abilities, mobility, and power associated with them. Diversity is encouraged by disallowing Sentinels to be used more than twice in a row, after which the pilots need to rest. This restriction and other mechanics of this mode are thematically tied to the story the game tells. At first, I couldn't help but feel like the strategy elements were the weakest element to the game. The visuals just feel lackluster compared to how the rest of the game is rendered, but as things unfold, it becomes apparent that it's necessary to represent the gameplay the way it is. That being said, it's not the worst strategy game, but certainly nowhere close to the best. Some kits are more useful or powerful than others, making some pilots less attractive to utilize in many missions. The game tries to coax the player into changing things up through bonus challenges. This works to some degree, and often results in unique interactions. Destruction mode largely serves a narrative purpose, so these apparent shortcomings are less bothersome than they may seem. If you don't want to engage with it beyond what's required for the story, thankfully you aren't punished for it. Vanillaware as a game developer is an anomaly. You almost never know what to expect from them outside of their illustrative art style. The jump to science fiction from fantasy stories is ambitious enough, but that ambition is amplified by simple, but thematically appropriate strategy elements, player control over their experience, and the sheer scope and payoff of the story. In some ways, 13 Sentinels feels like making up for lost time, or perhaps a Hail Mary effort to attract a larger audience. As of recording this, there doesn't seem to be any indication that the game will get ported to anything outside the PS4. It's not clear on what kind of deal Sony has with Vanillaware or Atlus, but hopefully this observation will date itself sooner than later, when or if a PC port comes out. Describing what makes the game special is a huge risk, because I've pretty much spoiled the game too much already. But I hope this closing remark can clue you in. Forgettable is not a word I'd use to describe 13 Sentinels. It's a one-of-a-kind experience where I wish I could go back in time and start over again. If anything I've said about it has at least piqued your interest at all, don't sleep on it. Your experience with 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim will occupy your memory for the foreseeable future.